the last 10 years, there have been over 30,000 railroad crossing collisions, resulting in more than 3,600 deaths. Last year, Louisiana ranked 4th nationally in vehicle and train fatalities and 1st in the most accidents per public grade crossings. Train accidents, and specifically railroad crossing accidents, can have devastating effects on motor vehicles. When a train hits another vehicle, a car, a truck, or an SUV, the results are catastrophic. Often these accidents and deaths could have been prevented. Figures from the National Transportation Safety Board state that approximately 60% of all railroad crossing fatalities occur at unprotected or passive crossings. Passive crossings are those crossings with only a railroad crossing sign. Surprisingly, the statistics also state that protected crossings, those crossings with warning devices such as lights and gates, represent only 20% of the public railroad crossings in the United States. The National Transportation Safety Board publishes some national statistics you should know more about that are really astounding. The National Transportation Safety Board also lists the 10 most dangerous states for railroad crossing fatalities, as seen here. Today, the Insider Exclusive presents Train Accidents, the Rachel Duncan story, and how her lawyer, Michael Cox, partner at the law firm of Cox, Philo, Camel, and Wilson, got justice for Rachel by proving that the train that rendered her a quadriplegic and killed her sister was obstructed by overgrown vegetation. And most importantly, that the railroad company was and is responsible for assuring that train crossing warning systems are active and in working order. Too often, railroad companies allow weeds, grass, trees, and other vegetation to overgrow near railroad crossings. And this overgrown foliage prevents motorists from seeing an oncoming train and causes these deadly, catastrophic accidents. Mike has earned the highest respect from citizens and lawyers alike as one of the best trial lawyers in Lake Charles, in Louisiana, and in the nation. He has seen many innocent and hardworking people become victims of corporate negligence. And because of that, he is driven to fight for people who have been harmed by the willful or negligent actions of others. His goals, not only to get justice for his clients, but to make sure that all Americans have the right to safe railroad crossings and that there are safety regulations in place that control what kinds of warnings and safety equipment are installed on railroad crossings. Because injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Hi, I'm Steve Murphy, and this is the Insider Exclusive, live from Lake Charles, Louisiana at the law firm of Cox, Philo, Camel, and Wilson. It is my great pleasure to introduce Mike Cox to the show. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Thank you, Steve.
Today we're going to be talking about the Rachel Duncan case, a horrific train accident. But before we get into the case, tell us who Rachel Duncan, your client, is.
When I was first asked to represent this family by a friend of theirs and a friend of mine, I went to their house in DeQuincy, Louisiana, north of DeQuincy. She's a country girl. They lived in a very modest house. It was elevated on stilts, and there were actually rooms in the house where you could see through the floor to dirt. A very modest upbringing. Very simple, honest, good country people.
Now, back in, I think it was September, this case goes back away, September of 1994. She was on her way to church?
That's correct. And I need to mention, Steve, you know, she was a brilliant girl. Straight A's in school and still is a brilliant girl. Yeah. That's one important aspect of Rachel.
Right. And she was in this church bus, and there it was her and her two sisters.
Correct. And they were the only ones left in the bus. They had actually asked the bus driver if they could be dropped off last because they wanted to hang around the other children on the bus. The accident happened probably less than a quarter mile from their house.
And tell us a little bit more what happened as a result of the catastrophic accident.
Well, the way the accident happened is the van was pulling up to the railroad crossing and came to a stop.
Yeah.
There was a stop sign. They came to a stop, but the van stopped about 50 feet from the tracks. The driver of the van looked down the tracks for any approaching train in either direction and saw nothing.
Yeah.
So he believed it was safe to go. As he began to go, the train, which had been blocked from his view by some vegetation close to the tracks, was coming 45 miles an hour down the tracks. He never saw it until the last second, which is how these accidents typically happen, where you have a railroad crossing that doesn't have protection like gates and flashing lights.
Yeah, and those trains come up on you faster than you ever expected, don't they?
The key word that you just said is expected. People don't expect a train.
Yeah.
And the reason they don't expect a train like they would expect an automobile at an intersection is because the trains hardly ever come.
Tell us a little bit about what happened to Rachel.
No one really exactly knows. Rachel's sister was killed in the accident.
Amanda.
Amanda, correct. She was a year older than Rachel. Rachel's youngest sister was too young and in shock to remember anything that happened. She was physically relatively unharmed, but she witnessed all this. They found her just walking around in shock after the accident.
Really? And Rachel at that time was how old?
Rachel was 11.
Okay.
Rachel had a very serious head injury in addition to the neck fracture, which paralyzed her. So no one exactly knows what happened inside that van. The youngest sister was ejected, and she didn't get hurt. Rachel, unfortunately, stayed in the van and was injured very badly. The van was mangled by the train, as is almost always the case when you have a train that hits an automobile.
I understand there had been a lot of complaints against the same against the train was KCS, right? Kansas City Southern.
That's correct.
And there had been a lot of complaints sent to them regarding this railroad crossing, and they hadn't bothered to clean it out, had they?
Well, that's true. Not only with regard to this particular railroad crossing, but also in what we call the corridor.
Yeah.
This track runs parallel to a main highway, Highway 27. And there are numerous crossings across the railroad track of different roads that intersect the highway. There had been complaints all up and down this corridor. The jury didn't get to hear that. They only get to hear about complaints at this particular crossing.
Is that because it was excluded?
Yes, exactly. But this crossing isn't unique. That railroad company, Kansas City Southern, had problems at many crossings in this same area. And people complained about all of them. There were, not all of them, but about many of them. There were many accidents at different crossings in this same area.
Right.
So this is not an isolated problem, and it's not an isolated problem with Kansas City Southern. Unfortunately, it's a problem with many of the railroad companies in America.
Yeah. Now, walk us through, when your friend came to you and said, would you represent Rachel? Walk us through what the challenges you had and the legal strategies that you had to deal with to win this case.
The biggest challenges were these, Steve. In Louisiana, there was no specific statute at the time that required a railroad to clear its crossings of vegetation so that drivers could see down the tracks and see approaching trains. There was no such statute, a written law passed by the legislature. So what we had to do was look at old case law. And at the time, there was no good case law that the courts had created imposing a duty on the railroads to clear their crossings. And that was one of the big problems. That's why they weren't doing it. There was really no clear legal obligation on the part of the railroad. But we were able, in some sense, to create law in this case and impose a clearer duty on them to clear out vegetation around their
under
tracks.
the auspices of there should have been reasonable care or a standard, right?
That's exactly right.
Yeah. So this case really set a new standard for the railroad companies to pay attention to, didn't it?
No question it did.
Now,
It did. There was another challenge that I've got to mention, and that is it's called federal preemption. Sometimes there's federal law that can supersede or trump state law.
Yeah.
And that was one of the big arguments by these railroad companies, that the federal government, the Federal Railroad Safety Act, had certain rules about what railroads had to do at crossings.
In other words, the railroad company wanted to remove the case. You filed it in state court. They wanted to remove it to federal court where the law is much more favorable to them, right?
They wanted to apply federal law in general, and they did later try to remove it to federal court. But they wanted to apply federal law because under federal law, there's no remedy for people who get hurt by the companies. There's an obligation on the railroad to do certain things at crossings, and there might be penalties, monetary penalties for not doing it or whatever. But people who get injured have no remedy to sue under tort law.
And that's still current today.
That is. It's called federal preemption. And they use federal law as a shield to shield them from any liability for people who get injured like this. And they tried it in this case, and it didn't work because they couldn't prove the things they needed to prove. If the railroad company can prove that federal funds were used in any way to upgrade the crossing, for example, the stop sign that existed at this crossing, if the railroad company could have proven that they used federal funds to put that stop sign in, we were out of court. Done. Rachel probably wouldn't be alive today.
Yeah. Now, you tell us about the verdict. It was an amazing verdict, wasn't it?
We got a fair verdict, we think. It was over $28 million.
Right.
And that seems like a lot of money unless you hear the details of the case.
Please.
And and I can't do it in this short a time period because it takes hours and hours to describe all the help that Rachel would need over the course of her life to remain healthy. She has to have around-the-clock assistance in her home.
Yeah.
She has to have certain sterile and invasive procedures that need to be performed by a nurse.
Yeah, and this all costs a lot of money.
It costs a lot of money, and initially we couldn't even tell the jury early in the case the amounts that we would be asking for because the natural reaction is to say, wait a minute, that's too much money for anyone to get.
Yeah, because they don't get it, do they?
Not initially. No one gets it until it's explained to them in great detail, and then they realize she needs this money. And that's the fact. And I think that's why Rachel's healthy today and enjoys a good quality of life.
Well, we are lucky enough to have Rachel with us today, and she's going to come on our show right now so she can tell us exactly, what life is like today under these circumstances. So let's do that right now. It is my great privilege to introduce Rachel Duncan to the show. Welcome to the show, Rachel.
Hi.
Thank you very much for coming here today. Going back to 1994, September, what do you remember about that incident?
Not really much. I remember going to church and then coming up to the tracks and then waking up a few days later.
In the hospital. And your whole life had changed. You were 11, weren't you? The whole life changed forever, didn't it?
Yes, sir.
What were some of the thoughts that you had at that time and going forward about that incident?
Well, at first I was really confused because, I was at church and this still happened. But eventually I accepted it and just learned to deal with it and live with it.
Now, it has been 17 years later, right? 17 years later. And as you look back, you know, on this horrible incident that happened to you. What are tell our audience a little bit about some of the daily activities that you do that entertain you, or how's your life? What do you do?
Well, during the week it's pretty boring because
Yeah.
I just sit at home. But on the weekends, like, I go to the movies and go
You
out
go to
and
the movies?
hang out with my friends and go
Yeah.
to church on Sunday.
But you need round-the-clock care, correct? And you live with some of your family?
My sister and her husband live with me.
Is that Miranda?
Yes, sir.
Oh. Okay, well, you know, and Mike, explain to our audience a little bit about how, you know, you got a good verdict, they fought that tooth and nail, but how are the costs evaluated to determine how much money a person is going to need to take care of them the rest of their life?
It starts with Rachel's doctors, and they give us opinions about the different medical procedures that she's going to need throughout life. And then once we have all the different opinions from the different doctors, we give it to a person called a life care planner.
Right.
They have certified life care planners. And they take all of those things, they project them over Rachel's life expectancy, and they put a cost on them. And it's a great cost. It's everything from Q-tips to nursing care.
Yeah, and I want our audience to know that the defense also has their life care experts, and they usually don't want to give you the best kind of care, right?
I will tell you that
They
the
want to give
care-
you substandard care.
The care they wanted to give Rachel would not only have been substandard, it would have been illegal.
Yeah.
Their life care planner had a suggested figure of $2 million compared to our life care planner's figure of $17 million. And the jury gave us exactly $17 million.
Yeah. You know, it's kind of interesting in these kinds of cases, and you know, you are aware of this. They tried to drag it out because if someone doesn't live, then they don't have to pay as much money, right?
Let me tell you something that happened in this case, Steve, and this is horrible. Rachel, during this case, before trial was ever had, was not doing very well. She was in a hospital in Shreveport, Louisiana. And it was touch and go. She was on the edge of death. This was literally the week before a jury trial. After 3 years of litigation, the defense came into this case and removed the case from state court to federal court, which you're not supposed to be able to do after a 1-year period. And my belief is that they did this in hopes that Rachel wouldn't live to see the trial, because if she had died, it would have cut that $17 million out of this case.
Yeah.
Well, the strategy backfired on them. Rachel wasn't going to be able to attend trial live because she was in the hospital. But instead, we went to trial. It was much later, but Rachel got to go testify. And I think that this jury understood Rachel, they liked her, and they wanted to help her.
Good. Good. That's good. You're an amazing person, Rachel.
Thank you.
What kind of movies do you like?
Pretty much anything.
Yeah. Who's your favorite actor?
I don't really have one. I just like watching movies.
She likes guys like Matthew McConaughey,
Oh, okay.
the good-looking type.
Yeah. Too bad he didn't show up here today.
I
huh?
know, right?
Sorry, I wasn't Matthew. Well, listen, I want to thank you very, very much for being here. Really, seriously. You're an inspiration. If you can do it, anybody can do it, right?
That's right.
Yeah, is that what you tell yourself every day?
Sometimes.
All right, thank you, and best of luck to you.
Thank you.
Mike, I can see Rachel change your life, didn't she?
Oh, unbelievably so.
Yeah, when we were talking at the break, you mentioned this was your second jury trial.
That was my second jury trial.
Yeah, and you went to see the movie Time to Kill?
I saw Time to Kill with Matthew McConaughey, and borrowed some of his drama in the courtroom. I think it was inspiring to me at the time.
Yeah, that's what it is. You have to tell a story from the heart, you know, and Rachel is such an amazing individual, and you, I'm going to be perfectly honest with you, you saved her life. It was because...
I think we helped, no doubt about it.
It's because of the verdict that you got that provides the money that she needs to live a satisfactory life that she's here today.
No doubt about that.
You know, and that's why we do these shows, because in my mind and in the audience mind, you are the hero.
And I think we make the world a safer place
Yeah.
as personal injury attorneys. Railroads get this kind of verdict and they make some changes. Product manufacturers are sued for dangerous products,
Yeah.
and they change the product to make it safer, and on and on. So we do have a useful function in society. We make the world a safer place.
And as a result of her case, new laws were passed in this state. A new standard was set in this state about clearings at railroad crossings, right?
Yes.
So congratulations. It was a great case, and you did a great job, and thanks for spending time with us.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks for joining us. You can get more information about our guest and the issues at insiderexclusive.com.